In the dead of night, under the cover of darkness and with only the clothes on their backs, some of the wealthiest families in France slipped across the border in unmarked carriages, leaving behind palaces, vineyards, and centuries of inherited privilege, because they finally understood what the mobs marching on. Paris already knew when the tipping point arrives, money can buy almost anything except a second chance once the gates are stormed. 128 years later, in the frozen Russian winter of 1916, Grand Dukes and Countesses disguised themselves as peasants, bribed railway workers with the last of their jewels, and fled south toward Crimea, praying the trains would outrun the revolutionary tribunals that had already drawn up their death lists. And tonight, in 2025, private jets, registered to shell companies in Delaware and the Caymans, are lifting off from obscure airports in Wyoming, Idaho, and Texas, bound for New Zealand bunkers, Portuguese golden visa states, and quiet lakeside compounds in Switzerland. Because the people who can read the warning signs better than anyone else have quietly decided that the America they helped shape is no longer the safest place to keep their families or their fortunes. History doesn't whisper. It screams, but only a few ever hear it in time. The ultra-wealthy have always been those few. They sit on the boards that control the flow of information. They dine with the intelligence analysts who brief presidents and prime ministers, and they employ the same risk consultancies that once advised Roman patricians on which provinces would fall first to the barbarian invasions. When these people start moving their children into boarding schools in Singapore, when they begin transferring 9 and 10-figure sums into trusts domiciled in places that have no extradition treaties, when they quietly acquire citizenships in nations most of their fellow citizens have never heard of, something far more profound than a stock market correction is already underway. This is not panic. This is preparation. And it has happened the same way, with eerie precision, in every society that was about to tear itself apart. Travel back with me to the spring of 1788. Versailles is still the most magnificent court in Europe. The gardens are blooming, and Marie Antoinette is ordering another dozen silk gowns that cost more than a rural village will earn in a lifetime. Yet in the salons of Paris, the smartest aristocrats are already liquidating estates at fire sale prices, converting land into gold coin, and sewing diamonds into the linings of their coats. The Duc d'Orléans, cousin to the king and one of the richest men in France, secretly funds revolutionary pamphlets while simultaneously packing his most portable treasures for a quick escape to England. The Prince de Condé transfers regiments of loyal cavalry to the eastern frontier, under the pretext of training exercises, positioning them for a swift retreat into Germany the moment Paris falls. By the time the Bastille is stormed in July 1789, more than 8,000 nobles have already vanished across the Rhine or over the Channel. Those who waited even a few months longer discover that the mobs have no interest in negotiating with people whose names appear on centuries-old tax exemption rolls. Within 4 years, 7 out of 10 émigrés who stayed too long will lose their heads to the same guillotine that once entertained the Parisian crowds. Fast forward through the smoke of history to the winter of 1916. Petrograd is starving. The Tsar is losing a war he cannot win, and the Romanov family still believes that 300 years of dynastic rule will protect them the way it always has. But in the marble corridors of St. Petersburg's grand palaces, a very different conversation is taking place. Countess Klein Mitchell records in her diary that every night another family disappears, servants dismissed without warning, paintings removed from walls, silver melted down into easily transportable ingots. Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, one of the most intelligent members of the imperial family, begs his relatives to leave while the trains are still running, but pride and delusion keep most of them frozen in place. Meanwhile, lesser nobles who own factories in Ukraine quietly sell their shares for suitcases full of foreign currency and board steamers to Constantinople. The Swedish and Norwegian Embassies are suddenly overwhelmed with requests for transit visas from people who have never before considered Scandinavia a desirable destination. By the time Lenin's train arrives from Switzerland in April 1917, the wisest of the Russian elite are already gone. Those who hesitated are rounded up 18 months later and shot in basements, or marched into the Siberian snow. The Bolsheviks published the departure manifests of the White Star, line as proof that the bloodsuckers abandoned the nation they had bled dry. Now look at what is happening right now in the country that once advertised itself as the land of the free and the home of the brave. In 2023, applications for New Zealand's investor visa category spiked 400% in a single quarter, almost all of them from American passport holders with net worths above $100 million. Real estate agents in the remote South Island report that fortified estates once marketed to Russian oligarchs are being snapped up by West Coast tech founders who insist on underground bunkers, helipads, and off-grid power systems. In Portugal, the Golden Visa scheme that was supposed to attract Chinese and Middle Eastern capital has quietly shifted. More than 60% of new applicants in 2024 and 25 are from the United States. The same law firms that helped Facebook billionaires secure Maltese passports in 2021 are now doing brisk business setting up Plan B, citizenships for hedge fund partners and private equity titans. Singapore's family office approvals, already among the hardest in the world to obtain, have waiting lists measured in years, and the majority of the names on those lists are American. But the truly telling detail is not the headline-grabbing purchases of entire islands or doomsday ranches. It is the quiet, systematic liquidation happening beneath the surface. Trust and estate lawyers in Manhattan and San Francisco report that ultra-high net worth clients are moving assets out of revocable trusts into irrevocable offshore structures at the fastest pace since the panic of 2008. Art dealers say that masterpieces that once hung in Hampton's compounds are being shipped to climate-controlled free ports in Geneva and Luxembourg, places where neither subpoenas nor mobs can reach them. One major auction house privately admits that American consigners now insist on anonymity clauses that were once the preserve of sanctioned Russians. And perhaps most chilling of all, the private jet tracking accounts on social media have begun noticing the same pattern. Late-night departures from secondary airports, flight plans filed for one destination but quietly amended mid-flight to another, aircraft registered to single-purpose LLCs that dissolve days after landing. This is not random. This is choreography. The same risk consultancies that once produced classified reports titled France 1789 Early Warning Indicators and Russia 1917 Failure Cascade Analysis are now circulating documents with titles like United States 2025-2032 Fragmentation Scenarios. One such report, leaked to a European financial newspaper in early 2025, lists 7 specific thresholds, everything from sustained negative real wage growth to the politicization of the Federal Reserve, and notes that the United States has already crossed 5 of them. The final 2, widespread rejection of federal authority by at least 12 state governments and the open fracturing of law enforcement loyalty, are described not as possibilities but as probabilities within the current presidential term. The people who pay 6 figures a year for these reports do not shrug them off. They act. And yet the most extraordinary part of this story is how little the rest of the country seems to notice. While cable news argues about culture war trivia, the Gulfstream fleet is quietly repositioning itself to the Southern Hemisphere. While politicians promise to tax the rich are restructuring their wealth in ways that no future Congress will ever be able to touch. While ordinary families struggle to pay medical bills and college tuition, the families who own the pharmaceutical companies and the student loan services are obtaining second and third passports that will allow them to watch whatever comes next from a safe distance. This is not conspiracy. This is consequence. The same consequence that emptied The Parisian salons in 1788 and the St. Petersburg palaces in 1916, history is not repeating itself. It is simply following the same cold equations it always has. Because here is the part no one wants to say out loud. When the people who can afford to leave start leaving, the society they leave behind has already entered the terminal phase. The French aristocracy did not flee because they suddenly discovered a love of English weather. They fled because they understood, with perfect clarity, that the social contract they had spent centuries exploiting had finally been torn up by people who had nothing left to lose. The Russian nobility did not abandon their estates because they grew tired of caviar. They abandoned them because they could read the execution lists being drawn up in smoky back rooms. And today's American ultra-elite are not relocating to Auckland and Lisbon because they prefer the climate. They are relocating because their algorithms, their analysts, and their instincts all deliver the same message. The America that protected their fortunes for 3 generations is no longer willing or able to do so. The tragedy, of course, is that their departure accelerates the very collapse they fear. When capital flees, jobs disappear. When talent flees, innovation stalls. When trust flees, communities fracture. The France that guillotined its aristocracy did not become a utopia of equality. It descended into a decade of terror, followed by a generation of war. The Russia that murdered its nobles did not birth a workers' paradise. It delivered 70 years of gulags and breadlines. And the America that watches its most privileged citizens quietly disinvest will not magically solve its problems once the private jets are gone. It will simply discover that the people who understood the system best no longer believe the system is worth saving. We still have a choice, but the clock is measured in months, not decades. The exits are already mapped, the planes are already fueled, and the passports are already stamped. History has seen this moment before, and it knows exactly how the story ends when the people who can leave decide that staying is no longer the rational option. The only question left is whether the rest of us will force a different ending before the last Gulf Stream disappears over the horizon, carrying with it the final remnants of the world we thought would last forever.